change is part of any life. Our time, our lifetime is subject to particularly rapid and global change. This has all pervasive effects on all walks of life, but also, of course, on our monuments and sites which we want to protect, and on the other hand, they are more and more difficult to protect because there is change. The response we have to give to this situation is a response which means, first of all, that in monument conservation we move up in scale. Since there is change in demography, there's change in infrastructure, there's change in urbanization, we try to protect our monuments by enlarging the scale at which we protect them. We are not just protecting single monuments today, we rather look for the protection of ensembles, of historic quarters, of historic city centers. We look into the protection of cultural landscapes. That's even another scale. And we look at the protection of a whole series of monuments. For example, we look at the protection of the series of Hanseatic towns. We look at the protection of monuments and sites along the pilgrim routes of Saint-Jacques de Compostela. That means we have huge linear spaces at which we look where all the monuments, and there may be thousands of monuments, which we wish to protect along a pilgrim route. A pilgrim route to Jerusalem, a pilgrim route to Saint-Jacques de Compostela, a pilgrim route to Rome, a route like the famous pilgrim routes on the Kii Peninsula in Japan or in other parts of the world. It's typical for our time that we have to move up in scale, which has very deep implications, not only on the way how we think, but also on the way how we should teach. We should teach nowadays not just how to preserve a monument. We have to place the monument within a complex landscape, in the complex context of a changing perception of the role of monuments, a changing situation of impacts, for example, the globalization of the climate change. The climate change which is all pervasive, whether we are in a developing countries or in industrialized countries, is something we have to respond, and we have to prepare our students for this response, which climate change requires, that we address that question at all monument sites, particularly along monuments and protected sites and areas which lie in coastal areas or in river valleys where this change is particularly felt. Demographic change particularly in developing countries, and increased urbanization throughout the world. This has enormous impact on the monuments which are all over more and more threatened by infrastructural development measures, by increasing scale of human settlements, of the heights of buildings. That in itself means that our students have to learn about the threats and how to handle them. That means they must learn how to manage cultural heritage in a time of change, in a time where they have to move, to look not just at the protection in making appropriate measures for the conservation of monuments, but they have to look outside, what's happening outside of the monuments. They need to know how to establish buffer zones. They need to know more about the management of buffer zones, because our monuments, our ensembles, our cultural properties need to be increasingly shielded off of developments which would destroy, for example, the aesthetic aspects just by high-rises built too close to the monument or to the cultural site. They need to be protected against wild settlements, which you find in many parts of the world in developing countries. So with other words, the people we wish to train have to be aware that management of conservation site is in fact management of change. This is a new philosophy. So far everyone thinks, well, a cultural heritage protection is a static discipline. We protect, we put something under glass and say that's it. It should remain as it is. But in fact, what our students have to learn is to manage change, because nothing is static. Everything is subject to global climate change. Everything is subject to globalization. Everything is subject to moving up in scale. Everything is subject to an accelerated tempo of change which we can see throughout our society and which we feel as a serious impact on our cultural heritage. To manage impacts on our cultural heritage in a time of change in such a way that they do not lose their significance, that their values remain intact, that's a huge task, a complex task, increasingly complex task, a task which can be only solved by learning that we have not just to focus on the monument, but also on what's happening in the surroundings, and that we know how to manage people in the surroundings to respect our cultural heritage. That means that we know how to educate, to sensitize people, how we manage to communicate, how we manage to bring forward our case to politicians, to ministers of finances, and so on. Since the cultural domain is underestimated worldwide, we have to prepare our students that they take pride in being heritage managers. I put the emphasis not on conservation but on managing, because they have to become managers of change. They have to become managers of an increasingly complex situation and not just technicians, since everything is not just subject to a technical challenge to solve problems of conservation, but also a challenge which I would call of political nature, that we have increasingly pressures from all sides of the society, and we have to carve out our niche. We have to create understanding for our profession. We have to create an understanding for our concerns, and we have to obtain support from as many partners as possible, that we can finally preserve cultural heritage increasingly threatened. Increasingly threatened means that we need also increasingly support, because we need to mobilize many more forces than before because of the increasing scale of threats. As I said, the threats come even at the global scale.